If I speak like this, am I audible? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, so I want to thank Harry for inviting me to this fabulous festival and conference. It seemed to me the organizers had a rather deliberate plan in the way they've laid it out. On Friday, we had a lot of talks about pristine, pure science, forward-looking, but also, in a way, nostalgic, I felt. Yesterday, we had the gloomy, dark story about the present state of society. After 10,000 years of civilization, we still get ourselves in such a mess. And I thought the strategy must be for today that, in the words of Monty Python, it's time for something completely different. So I'm going to talk about a different kind of science and a different way of organizing, conducting society. My topic is cybernetics, this strange science that reached a kind of peak in the 1960s, which was the time of the counterculture, not coincidentally, and is now making a kind of comeback amongst artists and academics. I want to explore what draws people like me to cybernetics by pointing to a very direct relation to the theme of the festival. And I'm especially interested today in the politics of cybernetics. Donna Haraway famously ended her manifesto for cyborgs with the declaration that I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess, one of the great exit lines of all time. I wrote a book called The Cybernetic Brain with the enthusiastic subtitle, Sketches of Another Future. Like Haraway, I think of cybernetics as the best hope we have for finding new ways to act as well as think. But whenever I say that in public, someone stands up and explains to the masses that cybernetics is completely loathsome. Here's a quote. Cybernetics is the police-like thinking of the empire, entirely animated by an offensive concept of politics. Cybernetics is war against all that lives and all that is lasting. So I'm going to try and figure out today how these two totally different political evaluations of cybernetics can both exist. What's going on? First, the allure of cybernetics. What draws people to it? The answer is it's different. It's a different kind of science from all the sciences we've heard about so far at Sonic Acts. It belongs to a strange and unfamiliar paradigm in Thomas Kuhn's sense, almost a kind of anti-paradigm, I would say. What does that mean? I find it easiest to think about ontology here, meaning very simply, visions of what the world is like. We teach our children to think of the world as a knowable, regular, law-like, and predictable place. The modern sciences then find out what the regularities are, and thus put us in a position to control the world and refashion it to our own ends. This is the project, the stance, the way of going on in the world that Martin Heidegger called enframing, meaning dominating the world through knowledge, which comes very naturally to all of us. Gerard Ter Hooft, in the opening talk on Friday, obliged me by talking about the colonization of outer space. He thought it was quite normal to talk about colonialism as far as outer space was concerned. This is the way we routinely think about the world. Politically, this taken for granted colonializing stance is what me, Haraway, and many others want to get away from. This is where cybernetics comes in. Its ontology, its vision of the world is different. It begins from the assumption that the world is ultimately unknowable, an unpredictable place of emergence and becoming that will always surprise us. For the cosmologists, the discovery that 96% of the universe, according to the opening speaker on Thursday night, is mysterious dark matter is a self-generating challenge. They want to tame the mystery and make it predictable. For the cyberneticians, in contrast, we live in a dark universe, full stop. That's it. This, then, is the source of cybernetics' allure. It offers us a different image of what the world is like, which invites us to rethink from scratch all of the traditional academic, artistic, and certainly political problematics. This is why Haraway would rather be a cyborg, a cybernetic organism, than a goddess. But what does that imply? Before we get to that, one more general remark is needed. If the task of the modern sciences is to produce positive knowledge and to make the world more knowable, what is the task of cybernetics? Given its ontology of unknowability, it can hardly be to produce a conventional kind of positive knowledge. Instead, cybernetics is focused on ways of getting to grips with and getting along with a world that can always surprise us. That is why cybernetics has always been centered on adaptive machines and devices and strategies that cope with uncertainty and the unknown, and with the overall theme of control. This obsession with control is the starting point for the critique. But to get to that, we need to move down a level to cybernetics in action, in practice. Cybernetics got its name from Norbert Wiener's 1948 book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, which brought together strands of work in feedback control, information theory, and electronic computing, dating back to the early 1940s and World War II. We need to focus today on feedback. Explanations of this concept always center on the thermostat, the gadget that turns the heating on when the room gets too cold and off when it gets too warm. The thermostat is a feedback device inasmuch as it detects the effects produced by some other machine, the heating system, and returns, feeds back a signal dependent on that to control the machine itself. Thermostats are pretty boring, but we can make them more interesting. First, we can understand them as instantiating, playing out the cybernetic ontology of unknowability. The thermostat does not inhabit the knowable, calculable, and predictable world described by modern physics. Its universe is always dark, unpatterned and chaotic, the random fluctuations of temperature in a room. Thinking about the thermostat is thus a way to begin to grasp the cybernetic ontology. Simply imagine that we live in a world built from random fluctuations rather than fixed entities like quarks or DNA or even the physicist dark matter. We can also find here an instance of the cybernetic focus on coping with the unknown. The thermostat is not powerless in its chaotic world, it just reacts on the fly to whatever comes along. Second, we can make the thermostat more interesting by generalizing from it, as Wiener, Rosenbluth, and Bigelow did in a 1943 paper entitled Behavior, Purpose, and Cognition. No, Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. They argued that the thermostat has a purpose to keep room temperature constant, and that it can therefore be understood as a model for purposive behavior in general, in animals and even human beings, as well as machines. Cats, dogs, people, they're all feedback control devices that try to achieve their goals in an error-correcting fashion. Here we find the beginnings of the cyborg theme, setting humans and non-humans on the same plane, denying the specialness of the human that goes with the modern ontology. This again is a characteristic cybernetic move, generalizing from specific devices to an overall ontological picture. Humanity as a feedback element in a chaotic world. And third, this move opens the way for political critique. The political question is, how should we live our lives and organize society? Here, what would cybernetics look like if we played it out as a blueprint for a social world? The critical argument is that it would be a disaster, a horror show. In particular, it's easy to see how discussions of the thermostat resonate with visions of social control, with thermostat-like mechanisms sitting on top of and optimizing the performance of existing control mechanisms, the police, the army, all of those disciplinary apparatuses that fascinated and repelled Michel Foucault, that me and Haraway want to escape from. In the early days, this critique was articulated often in visions of giant artificial cybernetic brains taking command of society. The cybernetic brain itself is not a topic I can explore today, but it's not really what we need to worry about anyway. As the critique from Tikkun that I quoted earlier argues very forcefully, neoliberalism has developed its own endless list of petty mechanisms of cybernetic control, watching, detecting deviations from the program, acting back on them with more or less subtle, more or less brutal rewards, punishments, sortings, and expulsions. One thinks of Gilles Deleuze's remarks on control society. I personally understand this by thinking of the management of English universities as a perfect example of this sort of cybernetic apparatus. And the picture only becomes more sinister when one observes that what escapes this sort of cybernetic analysis are precisely the goals and purposes of feedback systems. Early cybernetics took it for granted that the thermostat tries to keep the temperature constant at, say, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That number, 70, is simply given, it's a given, supplied from outside the system. And no great analogical leap is required here to get from there to a society governed by a small group of politicians, bankers, and media men, Marx's blood-sucking vampires, setting the control parameters for their own benefit. This sounds to me actually like the world we live in right now, and that all right-thinking people want to escape from. Thus, the critique. Thermostat cybernetics motivates, operationalizes, and naturalizes a society of control and colonization. I've no idea whether contemporary neoliberalism owes anything historically to cybernetics. Probably not. Probably it just accumulated piecemeal. And yet, it seems clear that a controlled society is where one would easily end up if one followed the drift of Wiener-style, thermostat-inspired cybernetics. The standard critique is unstoppable here, I think. I think we should just accept that critique. But it's very important to me that there are other threads of cybernetics to think about with very different political implications. If feedback control modeled on servo mechanisms like the thermostat was at the heart of Wiener's cybernetics, other machines were central to other lines of cybernetic development. Two machines constructed in 1948, the same year that Wiener's Cybernetics was published, come immediately to mind. Gray Walter's robot tortoises and Ross Ashby's homeostat. The tortoises have been exemplary for subsequent developments in both engineering, especially situated robotics, and the arts, but I'm going to focus on Ashby's homeostat. That's 4 homeostats joined together. The homeostat was an electromechanical device that processed an input current, turning it into an electrical output. Its key feature was that if the current within it exceeded some preset value, a relay would trip and a switch would change the internal wiring. The machine would randomly reconfigure itself. Any single homeostat was inert and lifeless, but Ashby constructed multi-homeostat setups so that the outputs from each unit were the inputs to others. When first switched on, such setups were typically unstable, meaning that the electrical currents within the units would tend to grow exponentially. But then the relays would start tripping and carry on doing that, reconfiguring the circuits randomly, until the currents within the units tended to vanish and the setup became stable and quiescent. That's it, that's what the homeostat did. I have to admit that the homeostat sounds almost as boring as the thermostat, but Norbert Wiener himself described it as, quote, one of the great philosophical contributions of the present day. Why? What did he mean? Like the thermostat, the homeostat exemplifies the cybernetic ontology of unknowability. In a multi-unit setup, none of these units knew what would come back to it from the others. It simply reacted to whatever turned up. So the homeostat, again, fosters an image of the world as fluctuating and chaotic, dark, not regular and law-like. But while thermostats are hardwired and purely reactive, homeostats were more like agents. They actively explored the unknown via their output currents, and they reacted constructively to whatever came back by reconfiguring themselves. They engaged in dances of agency with the other homeostats, as I would put it, to make a connection back to my earlier work in science study. This is a new and richer cybernetic vision of the world than that conjured up by the thermostat, now of lively agents engaged in responsive and transformative interactions with the world. And it's this vision which was enacted in a largely British tradition of cybernetics, associated with names like Gray Walter, Ross Ashby, Gregory Bateson, Stafford Beer, and Gordon Pask, which I explored in my book, The Cybernetic Brain. With the homeostat in mind, we can return to the question of political critique. Again, the question is, what would homeostat-style cybernetics look like if we lived it out? The answer is not entirely straightforward. Like Wiener, Ashby was happy to generalize from his device to the world in general. In fact, he understood the homeostat as a crude model of the brain, which might explain the early fears of artificial superbrains. But today, it's important to recognize that he experimented with two sorts of multi-unit setups, symmetric and asymmetric ones. In the symmetric configuration, all of the units were free to adapt to the others. In asymmetric arrangements, the internal parameters of one unit were fixed, and the others had to try to adapt around it. Ashby himself was a medical man, and his career until 1960 was in a materialist form of psychiatric research. The 1940s and 1950s, when he worked, were the days of the great and desperate cures in psychiatry. Insulin and electric shock therapy and lobotomy. And Ashby understood these on the asymmetric model of the homeostat setup. The doctor had to be firm and unchanging while forcing the patient through a series of homeostat-like reconfigurations via electric shocks to the brain or whatever, until, with luck, the patient arrived at a state something like normality, as defined, of course, by the doctor. Oops, sorry. This thread of cybernetic development has not received much critical attention, but it's clear that the same critique as before goes through. the asymmetric thread of homeostat cybernetics can underpin and naturalize even more brutal and heavy-handed forms of social control than thermostat cybernetics. This is clear as a form of brutal psychiatry operating at the level of individuals. At the macro level, it seems like a good description of American, West European, and Israeli foreign policy in the Middle East, trying to shock the Iraqis, the Afghanis, the Palestinians, whoever, into some political state we find acceptable. To go back to the quote, cybernetics is the police-like thinking of the empire. Which leaves us with the symmetric version of Ashby's cybernetics. If he analogized his asymmetric setups to psychiatry and, in fact, warfare, he could also imagine social transpositions of the symmetric setup too. He discussed planning, for example, as a symmetric dance of agency between planners and plannees, in which the plans were themselves at stake and liable to revision instead of being imposed by one side on the other. Ontologically, the picture that emerges here is one of forward-looking experimentation in which, like Ashby's homeostats, all of the agents involved, including human ones, continually change, mutate, and become something new in processes of reciprocal engagement and adaptation, which I think of as a neo-Taoist image of decentered flows and becomings. This is where I wanted to get to, and now we can ask the political question again. What would this symmetric picture look like if we staged it in real life, if we tried to live it out? The first answer would have to be nothing like the control society feared and despised by the critics of cybernetics. Open-ended experimentation is the antithesis of thermostat-style control. It points to a continuous exploratory openness to what the world has to offer us, a stance of poesis and revealing at the opposite pole from Heidegger's notion of enframing, at the opposite pole from the colonializing impulse. Politically, then, as lived out, a symmetric homeostat-style cybernetics foreshadows a very different world from control society and contemporary neoliberalism. And we should not, therefore, be misled by the critique into tarring all the many threads of cybernetics with the same brush. In fact, a symmetric cybernetics is the most radical political principled alternative I can think of to the greyness of neoliberalism. And my own desperate hope, that's what it is that if people grasped and took seriously this neo-Taoist ontology I just sketched out and lived it, it would denaturalize neoliberalism and all of its works. We could just laugh at our masters' plans for pulling the levers of power. Their vision simply doesn't match how the world is, and then we could kick them out. Back in the 1960s, Alexander Trotsky spoke of an invisible insurrection of 1 million minds, which would simply outflank the establishment. This, then, is the political message I want to draw from the history of cybernetics. Instead of rejecting all things cybernetic as pointing to a logic of control, we could look more carefully and find radical political inspiration in the symmetric cybernetics that has grown from the homeostat. That's the central political point I wanted to make, but I probably need to go a bit further. If the critique of cybernetics finds it easy to conjure up real horror stories drawn from the experience of neoliberalism, what might count as examples for a symmetric cybernetic politics? Just what would it look like in the real world? In Haraway's second manifesto, the Companion Species Manifesto, she sketched out something like this symmetric picture as a performative analysis of love, of all things. We social scientists don't usually talk about that. Perhaps that's enough, and nothing more needs to be said. This might sound too romantic, but Donna Haraway is not a romantic. Or one could point to self-organizing anarchist communities, real or imagined, as William Burroughs did in Cities of the Red Night, or Thomas Pynchon in my favorite book, Gravity's Rainbow, or we could look at the Occupy movement today. But my own strategy is different. It's to descend further into specifics and to document and explore real-world projects that have somehow staged a non-modern ontology, and to contrast them with their more familiar modern counterpoints as a way of conjuring up what I think of as a cybernetic politics of practice, of doing things. My book, Cybernetic Brain, explored a whole range of real-world examples in fields such as brain science, psychiatry, situated robotics, management, education, the arts and entertainment, architecture, all the way out to non-standard mystical and Eastern spiritualities. All of these projects that I talked about in the book thematize coupled and decentered becomings of people and things. Perhaps the most striking example is the contrast between Ashby's brutally asymmetric psychiatry and the symmetric anti-psychiatry of Gregory Bates and R.D. Laing and others. Anti-psychiatry acted out a flat, non-hierarchical ontology of the sane and the mad, in which each was to be transformed in performative and often disturbing interactions with the other, with no pre-assigned telos of normality. Laing would say that Kingsley Hall, the center of anti-psychiatry, was a place where the mad could teach the sane to go mad, to become something new. I see a shift from psychiatry to anti-psychiatry as exemplary of the practical politics of symmetric cybernetics, exploration instead of normative control, open-ended spirals with no fixed destination rather than closed loops. This is the kind of thing one should have in mind in thinking more generally about cybernetic politics, other ways to be and other ways to act. Along the same lines, the book also discussed a whole range of artworks that acted out aspects of the cybernetic ontology, including Brian Geisen's dream machines, low-tech strobes that induced visions, of which several examples have been here at the Sonic Acts Festival in the last few days. Alvin Lucier's music for solo performer, the generation of music from an EEG readout from Lucier's brain. Gordon Pask's music color machine, an inscrutable adaptive device to which the human performer had to adapt in turn. And Simon Penny's Petit Mao, a mobile robot that lured spectators into literal dances of agency. Like anti-psychiatry, but in a different register, all of these works help us to grasp aspects of the cybernetic ontology. And they function as a kind of existence proofs, showing how ontology can make a difference in practice. They're concrete reference in the art world for carrying the politics forward. Today, I want to take this connection to the arts a bit further by discussing two new examples, two sonic acts, which are closely related to one another. Both feature swaying women making mysterious and hieratic gestures that somehow elicit music and connect very directly to Haraway's cyborg yearnings. And now I have to do something technologically complex, which may or may not work. No, I don't want that one, I want the other one. Oh, yeah, thank you. No, I don't want that. How do I get back to where I was? Oh, this is the same kind of thing, actually. You can watch them. No. Oh, yeah, I just want to be a bit further on in that one. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for the technological problem. Can you hear me if I speak over this? Shall I turn it down a little bit? Well, as you probably know, this is Clara Rockmore playing an electronic instrument dating back to the late 1920s, the theremin, in which the performer's gestures generate the sound by modulating a capacitive, performative but immaterial coupling to the instrument. At the end of the Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway... Oh, a bit louder, Clara. At the end of the Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway talks about... Oh, putting me off. Shush. At the end of the Cyborg Manifesto... No, you've got the idea, haven't you? Haraway talks about feminist science fiction, this is all she could think of, as a way of trying to add some reality to her cyborg vision, including a discussion of Anne McCaffrey's novel, The Ship Who Sang, in which a disabled woman achieves a sort of completion with her nervous system wired into the control system of a spaceship, becoming, for Haraway, a politically potent cyborg figure. We can easily see Rockmore as a real-world equivalent of McCaffrey's cyborg fiction. Rockmore as absolutely integral and tied into a strongly coupled, decentered, human electronic assemblage in which neither the human nor the non-human is dispensable, together accomplishing a performance that's beyond either alone. And I would emphasize a further feature of this coupling, its temporally emergent quality. The theremin was not a fixed thing like a piano or a guitar. As Rockmore explained, after she became fascinated by an early version, Leon Theremin developed the instrument further in response to her suggestions. And these suggestions themselves evolved in relation to Rockmore's increasing familiarity and experimentation with the instrument. So the experimental becomings of Rockmore, the instrument, and the sound exemplify and stage for us in the real world not only a cyborg coupling of people and things, but also one of those performative, productive, and transformative dances of agency I just discussed. An open-ended spiral with no fixed future destination. The history of Rockmore and the instrument thus play out for us in the real world the sort of open-ended performative experimentation and unpredictable becoming that hangs together with a cybernetic ontology. And now, my second technological trick. Let's try and do this. This is my second example. The second example is Julie Wilson-Bakowiecz in a performance from last year called Vogt Ritual. Again, we have the case of these hieratic gestures that somehow control the sound, But now the technology is different. Switches and sensors on the performer's hands and arms control a complex digital environment called body coder, shifting intensities and frequencies, controlling loops and delays, all ultimately deriving from Julie Wilson's voice as input. She's actually singing, that's kind of hard to tell. Like Rockmore, Wilson emphasizes that the technology of body coder doesn't exist independently of her performance, but has itself evolved in accompaniment with her growing expertise and her explorations of earlier versions, another open-ended, decentered, and emergent dance of agency. Thank you. And she notes that this is also true in real time. Quote, there's a kind of live negotiation that goes on between the acoustic voice and the processed. I sometimes have to listen more intently to the electroacoustic consequences than I do to my own acoustic vocalization. Each performance of Vogt ritual has then the same quality of an emergent, open-ended back and forth between the human and the non-human. So we could think of theremin and body coder performances as the accomplishments of real-life cyborgs, acting out the cybernetic ontology of decentered explorations and becomings in the real world, showing how the trick can be done in the arts, how to live it and what it can look like. In this sense, theremins and body coders would be a further punctuation of the trajectory of cybernetic machines, going beyond the concern with stability that characterized the homeostat in favor of experimentation and emergence. The theremin Clara Rockmore couple, or body coder Julie Wilson, could be our icons for a politically promising cybernetics, staging new and emergent practices, finding new ways to go on, new worlds and new civilizations here in the arts. And I could add a couple of further remarks. In her writings, Julie Wilson assimilates body coder and the Vogt ritual to a novel category of digital opera, and her text then moves to explorations of the human voice and techniques that have helped to extend its range enormously, with individual singers covering extraordinary intervals of up to 8 octaves. Here, we're in the realm of what I call strange performances, human capacities beyond what is usually considered normal or even possible, more often associated with Eastern yogis than Western musicians or singers. Wilson also points out that these techniques typically involve working both on the voice and on the psyche of the performer, often along Jungian lines, thus underlining a connection between the outer and the inner, between strange performances and altered states, emergent subject positions and selves. Elsewhere, she describes a whole new physical sensation of grainy resistance, she calls it, that emerged in the complete absence of any physical input alongside, quote, moments of acute physical and oral focus in working with body coder. She started feeling new things. And this highlights a further important aspect of the cybernetic dark universe, namely that we are totally part of it, not only as performative agents, but as ourselves unknowable, about which there is always something new and surprising to find. This was also the spirit of the anti-psychiatry movement and, of course, countercultural explorations of consciousness. Realizing and acting out the fact that we ourselves are not fixed entities is a key element of a neo-cybernetic politics, denaturalizing the tamed and domesticated modern subject that underpins neoliberal control strategies. Second, after the dark universe and dark matter, we could think about the dark arts, magic. References to magic have always stalked the cyborg, the golem of Prague, and the sorcerer's apprentice are all over the early cybernetics literature. And the Bokoviets are right to call their work Vogt ritual. Julie's performance looks like nothing so much as magical incantations and gestures. Somehow she conjures up strange sounds from thin air. Haraway, I suspect, is too modern for magic to figure much in her manifestos. But this magical quality serves as a reminder of how drastic is the cybernetic shift away from the modern sciences, and the extent to which it opens up or reopens spaces for rethinking and reenacting the dark universe. So, I've been doing my best to locate the fascination of cybernetics in its ontology of unknowability and to sort out vectors of political critique and promise by reference to a sequence of machines, thermostats, homeostats, thereminds, and body coders. And I can wrap up with just two very quick remarks. First, I said that neoliberalism probably hasn't owed much to technical developments in cybernetics, and I should say the same about these two examples I've just discussed now. The theremin predated cybernetics. Julie Wilson didn't read Haraway until the body coder project was well advanced. So what role does the discussion of cybernetics play here? It functions as an axis of political assembly. Though resemblances between the theremin and body coder might be obvious, it's only by stepping back to ontology that one can associate both with, say, Geissen's Dream Machines and Pask's Musicolor, and all the other projects I discussed in Cybernetic Brain, in robotics and management, the environment, and so on. The ontological reading creates what I think of as a practical gestalt, a gestalt of practices, in which apparently disparate elements, bodies, projects, artifacts, appear as part of a unified whole, a non-modern paradigm. I don't think that individual elements like Vogt ritual will ever be enough to trouble the society of control. But maybe a big enough assemblage could, denaturalizing it by staging a much more attractive alternative. My own political contribution then is this act of assembly via the trip through ontology. Second, why have I focused on art just now? The answer is that artists have taken the lead in exploring what I think of as symmetric versions of the cybernetic ontology in very imaginative ways, so we should pay attention to where they've got to. But art isn't enough. The political move must be to understand neo-cybernetic art as ontological theatre, as helping us to grasp the ontology of unknowability much more generally, by staging it before our eyes and showing us that it can be acted out, not just in art, but more importantly, in all the other practices and projects the cyberneticians started to open up, in psychiatry, biological computing, environmental management, whatever. This, for me, is the central role of cybernetic art in producing another world, as an avant-garde, not so much in art, but in an ontological politics of real-world practices. And that's the end. Thank you.